As educators and business owners in the education space, changes are something that we're very familiar with, but that doesn't make going through them any less uncomfortable. A lot of us have already made the big change of doing things like leaving teaching to enter our businesses. Some of you might be thinking about it right now or going through that sort of transitional period right now. And then, of course, within education itself, there are changes to legislations, to pedagogical research, not to mention changes in the business world and in digital marketing like algorithms and platforms and so on. Change is all around us, and we know that we have to keep up, especially with those important ones that affect us. But how do we be more of a leader in change when it's so uncomfortable? So I'm going to delve into this today, and if we're meeting for the first time, welcome to the podcast. I'm Sumantha, and as well as being a tutor myself, I'm a former corporate business trainer who became a qualified teacher, and then in 2017 I left the classroom and set up my tutoring business. Since then, I've worked with over 100 tutors to help them design a business that just really fits their definitions of success. Navigating change is a really big part of this, especially actually when I work with my one-to-one clients, because this is where we really start to think creatively. So when it comes to changes, whether we are on the receiving end, where we have to adjust and adapt, or whether we are trying to lead change, where we're trying to make something different, we're trying to steer a new message, it can be challenging in more ways than one. And it's not always as simple as just feeding the narrative that, oh, I'm just not good when it comes to changes, or people aren't good with changes. The reality is, sometimes it can question our beliefs, things that we thought were good practice, and it can make us feel insecure. For instance, I was of the generation of teachers who were taught differentiation in the classroom. It was the buzzword when I was training, and it remained quite prevalent for a very long time. Whereas now, research and best practice tells us that differentiation, or at least in its original form, the form that I learned, isn't the most effective way of teaching. Now, after I looked into it and started implementing it with my students, I was on board. But at first, I felt quite resistant because I believed in differentiation the way I was taught it, because I was trained to believe in it. And so it almost made me feel like maybe I was a bad teacher. I know that isn't the truth, but when you feel insecure, you see things through a very different lens, sometimes a bit of a warped lens. And I've experienced challenges with leading change as well. For instance, when you think of one-to-one business coaching or mentoring, you typically think about sitting down for an hour with your coach and having, a really focused and detailed session. And that's how it has traditionally been done for many years. And actually, that's how I used to do it as well. And therefore, the perception is that that must be the best way. That's what I need. However, having done that for a number of years and analyzing why my clients were experiencing so much overwhelm, even though they loved the sessions we were doing together, I realized it was because 1 hour is too much, it's intense, and they were already time poor. So they're having to find an hour in their diary to sit with me. Plus, you end up facilitating overthinking. And in an hour, my clients end up with a very long to do list. Now, some of my clients have loved it, especially the ones who used to work with me with the old model because they can see the clear benefits. But, there's been some resistance from some clients, and I've had to lead that change. But it hasn't been easy. But fortunately, my clients have mostly had faith in me and they've gone with it. But I've had to think so carefully about how I communicate because people are resistant when something is new and something feels unfamiliar. But the reality is that, for my clients, this is new in the tutoring world, but it isn't new outside of the tutoring world. And I'm talking about this because it really reminds me of a few years ago when parents were so resistant to group classes. They weren't in certain areas. So, for example, there were already so many 11 plus tuition centres, for instance. So, parents were generally quite receptive to group classes in that context. But for other year groups and other cohorts, they kept saying how they preferred one to one lessons. But as practitioners, we knew and we still know that in many cases, peer learning environments work really well. In fact, for my students, the type of students I teach in my subject, they really thrive in that environment instead of a one to one environment, and I've taught them in both. But because one to one tuition was the traditional route, parents assumed it would be the best. And over the years, parents I've seen are a lot more accepting of it, but tutors still have to be careful how they communicate it so that parents don't default to that safety of what they have already just always known. So there are two lessons that I've really learned from those situations that tends to help me navigate uncomfortable change. The first thing, and this applies mainly when you are leading change, is to have absolute certainty and conviction in what you're doing and why. My decision to move away from giving tutors ad hoc 1 hour ask me anything style sessions wasn't based on what someone else was doing in a blind way. And it wasn't based on something that I had read in a business book or heard in a podcast. It was based quite literally on 5 solid years of supporting tutors in that old model and gathering data and research and feedback based on that experience. I gathered the feedback from my clients, but I also used what I was observing and experiencing, and I packaged it together as the kind of data that gave me conviction that my decision was the right one, even if other people couldn't see it yet. And actually, I also made sure that, and this is the other lesson, was that the change was suitable for the people I was offering it to. So, in this specific situation, and to be honest, I have to be specific because this is so context dependent. The tutors who come to me for initial one to one support generally have a few goals and they need to make those goals happen. And these goals move them towards a more sustainable business in the future. And because we're building the foundation for that sustainable business, my support needs to be more action focused than deep coaching. However, when I invite them into the next phase, if they are ready to be in a more leadership position in their business, if they're ready to think about scaling, for example, that's where the deeper coaching happens because that's where it belongs. That's what they need. And I don't necessarily just give them an hour of my time, an hour's coaching. Sometimes I spend an entire day with them. Sometimes I enlist the help of other coaches and experts and I create something very bespoke for them. So again, it's very different to how a lot of other programs operate. I'm not saying I'm the only one who does this, but I haven't experienced anyone else who quite does it that way. So when you are leading change, you have to make sure that you are really certain in that change and why it's effective. Why is it actually needed? It needs to be supported by experience and data, and it needs to be completely tailored to the people you're offering that to. Now, if you tick all three of those boxes, and I'm not saying that nobody will be resistant, because there is another part of it, and that is how you communicate. But you have a much better chance of people seeing your vision because you've got substance behind this change you're implementing. And when it comes to navigating change that you have to adjust to, sometimes you simply do have to trust the process. There have been times with my business coaches where they've asked me to do something that kind of went against my instinct, and I like to follow and trust my instinct. But I also trust them. I've invested a lot of money in working with them. I chose them. So in those situations, I do trust the process. I give it a go. And importantly, if it doesn't work, I know that we have to adjust because that's actually a very normal and natural part of running a business. Anyway, you don't just do something and it works. You have to always adjust. But when I'm in a situation where there's just more available to me that doesn't rely on me just blindly, trusting the process. For example, that differentiation example I gave you earlier, where there was actual research that I could look into, I could read about it, I could find out why a particular change has come about. That actually really helps me adjust to it because I'm better informed. And even though my initial response might be driven by insecurity, because something that I've always believed in is now being challenged, maybe even proved incorrect. Usually, when I find out more, I realize that it isn't as binary as that. It's not that what I believed in or how I was doing things was incorrect. The concept of the outcome is still correct, but the method has changed. It has improved. And so that quietens that feeling of insecurity, and it just helps me ride that wave of change. But changes don't just come in the form of things like what I've talked about. Sometimes we have to adjust to a price increase where we feel really nervous to boldly charge a higher price to our clients. Sometimes change comes about when we have to just accept that something we've put a lot of work and energy into simply isn't working, and we have to have the courage to walk away from it or to change it. All of these things are tough, but they really are a part of being a good business owner. And I rarely place the word good in front of business owner because I do think that we shouldn't be so harsh on ourselves. We're already judging ourselves a lot, and we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do it, to that standard. However, in this case, accepting that almost every decision in our business is not a one and done and will have to change and we will have to continue to evolve, it actually puts us into the perfect mindset to ensure that our businesses are always supporting our needs, the needs of our clients. It's keeping up with general changes in our landscape that affect us, that are important. AI is such a perfect example of something that surrounds us that we either have to accept and get on board with, or we kind of get left behind. Now, that doesn't mean you have to use AI. If you are really against it for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. You don't have to do it, but we do have to accept the world around us is using AI. And a few ways that that might affect us is we have to think about how we're marketing ourselves, because the language we're putting out there is essentially training these large language models. And so our potential clients who used to do a quick Google search might be actually searching on AI platforms for recommendations for people who do what we do. So we have to acknowledge that our students might be using AI and we can't necessarily stop that. So we have to ask the right questions. How do we educate them? How do we help them use it responsibly? How do we embrace it perhaps in our practice? So it can be very uncomfortable, can't it? And actually, I'll tell you a huge thing that really helps. It's having a community around you with people who are forward thinking and who can have these kinds of really healthy conversations. You can have opposing views, but it makes you think. You don't want to be chatting to people who are really stuck in their ways and who are resistant to change because they'll only make the journey harder for you. And when I use the word community, it might be one or two people in your life. It might be a larger group of people, a larger community. It might be a free community. It might be a paid community, like what I have in the Tutors Mastermind. Either way, surrounding yourself with the right people and knowing what the word right actually means, especially in this context, is actually a really important part of navigating change and keeping yourself adaptable in a way that you feel safe. So, I know that this episode isn't one of my typically action focused ones, but these discussions I think are really important. I think they need to happen because we're in these situations and we might feel uncomfortable, but we need to know that discomfort isn't unusual and we're certainly not alone in feeling it. So, how you navigate change is so dependent on context as well as your mindset and the environment that you're in. So, even if you can pay attention to two out of three of those things, you will be in a much stronger position to embrace positive changes or even just to adjust to necessary ones, whether we like them or not. That's all from me today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have a really quick minute, I would love it if you could subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or hit the follow button and leave a short review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. It really helps podcasters like me who I'm a small podcast and I like to reach a really niche audience. I like to help our colleagues. So it helps me reach more people. You'll hear from me on Wednesday.